Ladies and gentlemen, I would never, not even on my most sardonic, most sarcastic, most satirical, most mockingly insincere day, ever dream of saying something on this program to fall afoul of the YouTube community guidelines. I say this because I know for an honest-to-God fact that the guidelines come from a noble and well-intentioned place, and they exist not to advance the interests of any certain political party that may or may not have a donkey for its mascot, but rather to save us dumb peasants out here in flyover country from the potential ravages of our own stupidity and credulity. We are good, hard-working, salt-of-the-earth people after all, but since most of us haven't got no fancy book, learning from no highfalutin university, we can sometimes have trouble differentiating between actual truth and dangerous Russian disinformation. So we all owe a big debt of gratitude, in my judgment, to the big tech executives who have worked so tirelessly to promote our mental hygiene. And it's with this spirit in mind that I want to open tonight by affirming my unshakable belief that the 2020 U.S. presidential election was the most sincere, most rigorously verified, most morally righteous result in the annals of human democracy. Now, there are some handmaidens of Putin out there who will insist on trying to tell you that there was something that felt dodgy about that election, that it was weird for 5 states to suddenly stop counting over a broken water main in Atlanta, that it was strange for the news media to be actively suppressing legitimate stories about one of the candidates. But I'm telling you right now, if you start going down that Russian conspiracy rabbit hole, well, you might as well be shooting little Ukrainian babies on the streets of Mariupol, you evil, awful, insurrectionist bastard. But while we can faithfully rely, just as we always have, on the noble intentions and the good ethical practices of our mainstream news media, there are some less reputable outlets who continue to fan the infernal flames of Russian disinformation by publishing articles that attempt to cast into disrepute the immaculate election of our beloved 46th president, the ever-healthy, ever-vigorous, ever-mentally lucid hero of the Republic, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. And so, the Epoch Times, which I'm pretty sure is printed on the grounds of the Kremlin, is out with a story in their latest edition making the monstrously perfidious claim that in the state of Wisconsin, 137,500 ballots were illegally cast in the 2020 election by unauthorized third parties, and according to state law, ought to have been excluded from the tally. And yes, to answer the question I know you're asking, 137,500 is a number larger than Joe Biden's margin of victory. And let me tell you, this is just about as despicable as Russian disinformation gets, folks, because this has all the outward appearances of a well-vetted, well-sourced, well-reported piece of investigated journalism, but Putin is sneaky like that. Putin has got his tendrils everywhere. He might have one of those things down your trousers right now and you don't even know it. Needless to say, you shouldn't bother spending any time with this article, nor with any article like it, because when you read articles like this, you attack the foundations of our democracy. Read this article and you might as well be the son of a bitch who stole Nancy Pelosi's laptop, because it's just about the same thing. But the author lays out this long, drawn-out conspiracy theory, and he dresses it up to make it look like it's meticulously researched and all the facts are independently verified. But the thrust of it is that unmonitored ballot drop boxes in Wisconsin were having ballots deposited in them hundreds of times by certain individuals, and this was verified and cross-referenced using mobile phone ping data. And the state law says ballots can only be submitted to the registrar directly by the voter. But we know what this really is, don't we? It is an assault on minority voting rights. These conservative media outlets and the Russian puppet masters, they know that ballot drop boxes are just intended to make voting easier for people of color in historically underserved communities. So obviously, if you don't like the drop boxes, if you think they're magnets for malfeasance that attract all manner of industrialized vote fraud schemes, well, say hi to David Duke for me when you see him at the Klan meeting, you dirty, white, filthy supremacist son of a... In closing, I'd like to once again give a warm thank you to Susan Wojcicki and everyone at YouTube for everything they do to keep us safe from racists and Russians. You are doing the Lord's work, Susie. Have a carrot on me. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where we have just received word that the construction of the George Floyd Memorial in downtown Budapest has been indefinitely delayed. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant, And we need to begin tonight all the way back on 21 October 1805. Off the coast of Cadiz, southwestern Spain and the North Atlantic, where the Royal Navy under Admiral Viscount Nelson routs the combined Franco-Spanish fleet in the Battle of Trafalgar, thus ensuring British domination of the high seas for the next 11 decades. Now, let's fast forward from there 10 years to June 1815, a Belgian meadow called Waterloo, where the combined British, Prussian, Dutch force under the Duke of Wellington hands Napoleon the final defeat of his career and thus ends the series of wars that carry his name. Now, this victory on land, combined with Nelson's earlier victory on water, meant that none of the continental great powers were going to be going out of their way to challenge Britain's military dominance at any point in the near-term future. So you have the beginning of what historians now call, though somewhat misleadingly, the Pax Britannica, which refers to the 100-year period between Waterloo and the outbreak of the First World War, when there were lots of European wars when you get right down to it. You had the revolutions of 1848, the Crimean War in 1851, the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, and so on, but there weren't any of the years-long worldwide empire versus empire slogging matches that had characterized much of the second half of the 18th century. But back to Trafalgar for just a moment. We know it was the victory that gave the Royal Navy unquestioned dominion over the world's oceans for a solid century, but what happened that allowed them to claim that dominant position? The simplest answer is they had perfected the art of building wooden sailing ships. They had the toughest, best-performing vessels on the ocean, and they had the best-trained crews, so inevitably they wound up whooping everybody's ass. And why was England able to build more and better warships than the other European powers? First, because the English oak is the best kind of tree to build a wooden warship out of, and in the 17th and 18th centuries, England had vast forests of it. It took about 1,000 full-grown oak trees to build one first-rate ship of the line. And even still, they stopped building warships out of wood before the supply of trees was ever exhausted. But cutting down the trees is just one thing. You've still got to figure out a way to transport them to the sawmill and then onto the shipyard, and you're living in an age where your only options for hauling loads are manpower, horsepower, and ox power. But here, again, England's topography provides the elegant solution. We've got an ample river system on this island, so all we have to do is harvest the trees, drag them down to the river, float them down to the sawmill, and then the sawmill guy, let's call him Mr. Sawyer, floats the beams and planks on down to the coast where the shipyard is. But this would not be the first time that England's geography and its abundance of a much-prized raw material would provide the English with a ticket to further world domination. The British in 1815 were in pretty good shape, War of 1812 notwithstanding. Nobody would challenge them on the high seas. Nobody had any ideas about a cross-channel invasion. But as colonial empires go, they kind of still had a crappy one at that point. They had lost the American colonies. They still had Canada. That's something. Australia was still sort of a penal colony clinging to the side of a rock at that stage. The East India Company was just starting to get its hooks into the subcontinent. They had a few Caribbean islands, a few scattered African colonies, and in a world of wooden sailing ships, that was the maxed out version of the British Empire. That's about as much of the world as you can effectively administer under wind power. But then, as the 1820s start turning into the 1830s, Britain comes to another realization about itself. This island has got a whole shitload of coal. Most of the deposits are near enough to the surface to be easily extracted, and we've still got that river system on our side, so it's just like we did it with the trees. We just got to drag the coal from the pit head over to the river. We float it on a barge down to the cities where they're building all the new factories. Queen Victoria comes to the throne in 1837, and the Industrial Revolution has just barely begun to stir, but by the time of her death in 1901, the British Empire is the British freaking Empire. She dies not just as Queen of the United Kingdom, but also as Empress of India, sovereign ruler of an empire encompassing 1/4 of the Earth's population on which the sun never sets. And what single factor accounts for that giant leap in power and prestige in 63 years' time? It's pretty simple. The English had the most coal. It was convenient to extract it from the ground, it was easy to transport it, and it was the best energy source anybody had ever seen. It didn't take the Royal Navy long to figure out that, hey, if we take a coal-fired steam boiler and stick it on a ship and attach it to a propeller, we don't need sails anymore. And look, I know people love to paint with big, broad moral brush strokes when it comes to colonialism in general and the British Empire in particular, but it is okay to look at the entire picture. And were there lots of abuses and depredations? Of course there were, but the coin has another side too, a side that says, to the extent that more than half of the world's people today live under democratic self-government, the single biggest factor in that reality is the existence of the former British Empire. By what other mechanism would India today be the world's biggest democracy? Can we agree that a unified democratic India is preferable to the former status quo of, 3 or 4 dozen princely states constantly warring upon one another? Because I think it's preferable. And you don't get there without the British, irrespective of what their intentions were. Now, let's just put it this way. When you walk out of a place after 100 years as the colonial overlord, there are a hell of a lot worse legacies you could leave behind than liberal democracy and cricket. I'm just saying. Now, speaking of that, here's a fun fact I bet you didn't know. The most watched sporting event in the history of television, not a Super Bowl, not a World Cup final, not an Olympic event. It was an India versus Pakistan Test cricket match in 2018. So the Brits do pretty well with their wooden sailing ships. They do a whole hell of a lot better than their steamships that they build after, and those are wooden at first, then they're ironclad, then they have steel hulls, because once you get to the 1850s, the Industrial Revolution in Britain is in high gear, and they're several decades, at least, in front of everybody else in terms of industrial capacity and strength of arms. And both of those factors owe 100% to being able to extract and transport huge quantities of coal over long distances. But now we can get the coal to the shipyards and the factories and the foundries even quicker because screw the rivers, we got railroads now, bitch! Which, of course, were another innovation made possible by the existence of the coal-fired steam boiler. Soon, for the first time ever, people from the countryside are able to travel into the city on Sunday for a day of family entertainment or cultural edification or both, and the railroad enables them to be home by nightfall. People who previously could never have dreamed of visiting a museum or hearing a symphony, whose ancestors had never ventured more than 10 miles from home, they can go pretty much anywhere now and do anything they want. Beach resorts become a thing. The first amusement parks are built. And what's more, the need for labor in the factories where the industry is happening means that working class people have some small prospect for autonomy and upward mobility where they never had that before. Where the prior 10 generations of your family may have never had much choice but to tend the same crops on the same family farm just like all their ancestors had done, suddenly a young man had the option of heading for the smoke, as they used to call it, going to the city and selling his labor for actual money. You might have even had your choice of 4 different factories to work at, and you could take the best offer. And that's a pretty mind-blowing departure, societally speaking, when things have mostly been the same, for the last 1,000 years or so. And it's also an overlooked benefit of the Industrial Revolution. The rise of organized industry has lifted more human beings out of poverty than any other single development in our history. And there is no industrial revolution without lots and lots of fossil fuels. I often hear young, screeching greeniette climate cultists saying, abolish fossil fuels and nonsense like that. But if I'm being honest, I wish I could wave a magic wand and actually deprive those people of all the things they have, all the things they cherish, all the things they think they can't live without that wouldn't exist without fossil fuels and petrochemicals. For a start, say goodbye to everything you have that's made of plastic. I know that's pretty much all of your physical property, but do you see the point yet? Second, you won't be using internal combustion engines anymore, so you'll need to get around on a bicycle, but not so fast. You're going to need to fashion some wooden wheels for your bike because rubber tires are loaded with petrochemical additives, so those are out. Now, rubber bike tires, not a part of our enlightened green future. You're also going to need a pair of leather-soled loafers to do your bike riding in because the soles on your Nike shoes, those are made of some of the most icky petrochemicals in all of China. And they were assembled by 8-year-old child slaves, but you didn't care about that before, so why should you now? Fossil fuels are a straight-up miracle. Once or twice a week, you drive to the gas station, you pull up to the pump, you stick the thingy in the hole. All right, go ahead and say it. And you don't even think about the fact that the liquid you're pumping into your tank is refined dinosaur carcasses. We take this sludge out of the ground that is made of old dead dinosaurs and we turn it into a consumer product that enables you to travel farther in 2 hours than 100,000 generations of your ancestors could travel in a week. And communications are no different. The first reliable telegraph wires had petroleum-based housings. For the entire history of the human race up until that time, the fastest you could transmit written information from one place to another was the speed of a horse. Within 10 years of the building of the first petroleum refinery, there was an operational undersea telegraph cable linking North America with the British Isles. And don't underestimate the importance of that little tidbit when you were considering all the myriad ways in which fossil fuels facilitated the rise of the British Empire to becoming the world's spanning behemoth that it had become by the reign of Edward VII. Colonial administration becomes far more convenient when you can pick up the phone and call headquarters anytime you require guidance, where for the previous 300 years, if you wanted to send a message from England to North America and get a response back, your best case scenario was 12 weeks, and that's if the winds are just right and the ship doesn't bloody well sink. And so, occasionally, you'd get a snafu like what happened with the end of the War of 1812, where Andrew Jackson kicked General Pakenham's ass up one side of New Orleans and down the other, but it didn't even count because they had concluded a peace treaty in Paris 2 weeks earlier and nobody knew it. And no wonder Jackson was such a grumpy old bastard. I'd be pissed off too if they whacked my greatest victory off the scoreboard like that. It freaking sucks. But we didn't stop with the steamships and the railroads and the telegraphs. Just like they had previously done with coal, British chemists started fiddling around with petroleum. And before long, it was, holy crap, this stuff's even better than coal. Except unlike gold, the British Isles didn't have a great abundance of it. And the ultimate dissolution of the British Empire, that trend line coincides almost uncannily with the process of petroleum supplanting coal as the world's foremost energy source of choice. And every major conflict since then has been on some level a war for oil. We used fossil fuels to become masters of the planet, and in doing so we gained the ability to traverse its surface essentially at our leisure. If you have the financial resources, you can be anywhere on this planet you want to be in 24 hours from right now. And think about what a crazy departure that is from the first 100 millennia that modern humans existed. And all of that has happened in less than 2 freaking centuries. We haven't just traversed the surface of the Earth. We have flown to the freaking moon and back, riding a pillar of flame made out of dead dinosaurs. And people who aren't able to take any appreciation or wonder out of that, or to marvel at the extent to which everything we take for granted about the modern world is down to the refinement and the exploitation of coal and petroleum, those people live in bleak, depressing worlds, and they should get a new religion because their current one sucks and it makes them miserable. Also, how about giving our species some credit for the incredible strides we have made in figuring out how to exploit these resources in such a way that it's less harmful to the environment? Go talk to somebody who grew up in LA in the 70s. They will tell you about a world where the smog blotted out the sun and the school wouldn't let you go outside for recess some days because the air was too toxic. But it's not like that anymore. We figured out how to build vehicles and factories that run cleaner, and we became the first country in the history of the world to improve our air quality while increasing our industrial output and the number of vehicles on the road. That is a stupendous achievement. How about let's enjoy it? There is no good reason, be it scientific, economic, ethical, or otherwise, why we should stop exploiting the best energy sources we have so long as we have them. The fact that a thing is finite is not a compelling reason to stop using it. It's a reason to prepare in a responsible way for the future eventuality when it comes around, but it benefits no one to shriek like a crazed religious fanatic and to traffic in apocalyptic doomsday scenarios that have no basis in reality or indeed in common sense. And that's it for tonight. Thank you very much for watching. Have a pleasant tomorrow. I will see you Wednesday. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.